Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Terry Fulp. I used to be with the Bureau of Reclamation, 31 years. I've been retired for a little over 2. Retirement is everything it's cracked up to be. I've been asked, though, to do something that I really enjoy, and that is get to talk with these fine folks, plus 5 others that are going to join us soon, about something that I love dearly and still follow very closely, and that's the Colorado River Basin. Can everyone hear in the back? If so, no. Closer? Really close? Okay, thank you. All right, when I get animated, which I usually do, someone remind me to get close to the mic if I stray away too far. All right, so our panel today, our discussion really is broken into 2 parts. In this first part, we have 5 speakers that are going to fill us in on really where we are today. The state of the river, the state of the management tools we've been using, and some about what do we need to be thinking as we move forward. And then after that hour, we'll be joined by 5 other distinguished panelists who I'll introduce at that time, who will engage in a full discussion. We asked our panelists, all of them, to submit ideas for questions and things they wanted to talk about. And from all of those, plus others, we distilled everything down into some themes. And so we'll talk to you again in that second hour around some themes. So let's just plow right in. And I'm going to introduce all of the speakers here. And I'll do it in some order. I don't think it's probably the order you're speaking in, but I can't remember. Maybe it is. First, we'll hear from Eric Kuhn. Eric's the retired general manager of the Colorado River District in Glenwood Springs, who now enjoys writing about the river's past, and probably nearly every one of you has read something that Eric's written. He's going to catch us up on the state of the river. David Palumbo. Let me just say, David and I have known each other and worked together for maybe an uncountable number of years. He's the Bureau of Reclamation's Deputy Commissioner for Operations. He's been that since 2005, and he oversees the 5 reclamation regions. The next speaker will be Amy Haas. Amy has worn various hats on the Colorado River, currently serves as the first executive director of the Colorado River Authority of Utah. That's a new state entity charged with protecting, conserving, using, and developing Utah's Colorado River entitlement. Amy's going to talk to us about the Upper Basin's drought contingency plan. Next speaker is Patrick Dent. Patrick's the assistant general manager of the Central Arizona project. He's responsible for their Colorado River programs and policies, the Central Arizona Groundwater Replenishment District, and water resources and policy analysis for CAP. He's going to talk to us about the Lower Basin Drought Contingency Plan. And then finally, Greg Walch. Greg's practiced water and natural resources law in Nevada for 32 years, the last 12 of which he spent as the general counsel for Southern Nevada Water Authority. He represents Nevada in the Mexico work, and he's going to talk to us about that work in collaboration with the 2 sections of the International Boundary and Water Commission. So that's who we are, and I'm going to turn it over to Eric.
Well, thank you, and thank you for the invitation. I go, wow, this room, I need a pair of binoculars, I think, to see the door. Anybody who's been to the Black Canyon of the Gunnison National Park, you know, when you drive up, you can see the.
I think you have to get way close.
Oh, okay. Now can you hear me? Well, all I said was I can't even see anybody there in the back of the room without binoculars. So, you know.
Okay, they couldn't hear you.
Yeah, that's right. They couldn't hear me. So I'll get on with it. You know, my job was to you know, take on, add on to what Margaret just said, and bring us up to what's the state of the river today. And I've labeled that 2023 gave us a breather, but for how long? Let's see. Is this advance? Oh, that's the wrong one.
Thank you, Margaret.
Now, advance. There you go. As you could, this is a graph on the left there that Jack Schmidt put together, and it's a little different perspective because it shows all of the basin-wide reservoirs in the Bureau of Reclamation's database, and that's federal and non-federal. It's upper basin and lower basin. It's not, you know, those on the Salt or Verde River. But you can see there in 2000 or so, about 60 million, and that's dropped off to about 30 million today. That's the blue. The orange is that component of it that was Lakes Mead and Lake Powell. And you can see, what I can see in there is you can see the droughts and you can see the wet years. Of course, 2000 to 2004 was the big, you know, that was the big daddy of the droughts. And you can see the recoveries, 5, 11, 17, 19, and 23. The other thing that I want to point out is the interim guidelines, in my view, have acted like a ratchet. It's like a step down. The reservoir dropped in elevation as we depleted storage, and then the wet years never recovered. So after every wet cycle or wet year, we ended up with less reservoir storage than before going into that wet year. And we'll see what happens over the next few years. The other one on the right that's come from the Colorado Sun, and that basically says Colorado's winter is off to an uninspiring start, climate experts say. So we don't really know what this year will bring. It's early. But I heard today from Chuck Coulomb at the UCRC meeting that the next 24-month study will show a drop of about 1 million acre-feet of unregulated inflow into Powell. I also know from looking at what the climate models say that expect dry conditions in the upper basin through about Christmas. After that, there might be a change of weather pattern, but we really don't know yet until it happens. That's 3 to 4 weeks out. So I'd like to know, Terry's a baseball fan. It's a little bit like the winter right now is like your favorite baseball team being 10 games under 500 in mid-June. You're still a month away from the All-Star break. Some of those teams will recover and do quite well, but most of them won't. Talk about the river. I think this one sets up the conditions. The river flows a century ago versus today. I take this from Delph Carpenter's December 1922 report, and he was the commissioner from Colorado, of course. And he was the most conservative when it came to assessing the water supply. So he thought, and this is natural flows, the natural flow at Leaf Ferry was 17.5 million. Below Leaf Ferry, there was another 3 for a total of over 20. The apportionments to the upper basin and lower basin is 16. There was a surplus of 4.5. Hoover said that surplus was like 5. Other commissioners said it was 6 or 7. Today, and since he rounded off to 500,000 acre-feet, which I think is a good move, I'll do the same. There's probably 12.5 million at Leaf Ferry. Below Leaf Ferry, maybe 1 million. Who knows? Total of 13.5. You subtract 16, you have a deficit of 4. So we've gone from a surplus in 1922 of 4 to 5 million to a deficit of 4 million. That's the basic problem on the river. And, you know, what that's done for the upper basin, for where I'm come from, is because of climate change and because of a possible interpretation of the compact that I think the lower division states are there and the upper basin states are not. We have a fixed numerator and a shrinking denominator. So in 1922, when they thought there was 17.5 million at Lee Ferry, the compact obligation was to deliver 75 or 7.5 each year. That was about 40% of the flow. Take that through the 1988 stress test. If the delivery is 8.25 and there's 13 million, that's over 60%. And if you even look at the 20 to 23 drought and the 11-year period from 2011 to 2022, the upper basin, under certain interpretations of the compact, the upper basin would have to deliver over 70% of the natural flow of the river at Lee Ferry. And that won't work. And that also shows that the burden of the basin of climate change is really on the upper basin. That wouldn't surprise anybody back in 1922 because they knew that 90% of the water in the river came from the upper basin. Some of the potential tripwires, I'll just go through these quickly. 10-year deliveries at Lee Ferry could drop below 82.5 by 2027 or 2028. It's a possibility, it's not a certainty. If this year is dry, it's likely to happen. If this year is not so dry, it may not happen. But certainly remember the interim guidelines gave us 5 straight years of 9 million acre foot releases. That's about 9.1 to 9.2 million at Lee Ferry when you look at the accretions below the dam. Some people call it leakage. We've got to make up for that. And that will come due. And I hope that's not a crisis. The other thing I want to point out, there is no 1920, in the compact, there is no definition of beneficial consumptive use. Think about that. What's the thing that the compact apportioned? Beneficial consumptive use. But they could not reach an agreement on how to define it. There were 27 meetings. At the 25th meeting, there was still a placeholder. It was Article 2B. It was going to be inserted right after the definition of the Colorado River system. They could not come together. So what did they do? Well, Hoover had a train to catch, so they just dropped it from the compact. That's literally what happened. So today we have 3 different definitions. There's a lower basin main stem definition that comes out of the parentheses in the Boulder Canyon Project Act. Article 6 of the 48 Compact is what's called the stream depletion theory. It's the impact of man-made depletions on the natural flow of the river at Lee Ferry. And for the lower basin tributaries, I'll say, who the hell knows? I'm not sure what kind of use we do. The other thing is I often ask my upper basin colleagues, you say that the lower basin is using more than their 8.5 million acre feet. How do you know? And they say, well, consumptive uses and losses report. Well, consumptive uses and losses report is not an interpretation of the compact. And no one could interpret the compact because there's no definition of beneficial consumptive use. So that's one of the problems. That's one of the tripwires we're going to have to get around. The other one that I'll go quickly is there's no allocation under the compact of the lower basin's 8.5 million acre feet. There is under the Boulder Canyon Project Act of the lower basin's 7.5 million acre feet of 3A water, but there is no compact, there is no lower basin compact, so there's no apportionment of the 8.5. And California and Arizona have been fighting over that for 100 years. I'm hearing they're going to settle that, so that's great news. Finally, I'll just leave you with this question. If the 10-year Lee Ferry flow continue a downward trend, when is it a crisis? And if it is a crisis, how do we avoid it? And I think that's one of the major obstacles we've got to deal with is avoiding a crisis. And that one on the left shows the box plots from the recent Bureau EIS. You can see the downward trend there. The one on the right is just a recent work that was done by the Colorado River District, my former employer. They look at 13, 11, and 9 million acre feet, and you can see at 13 million acre feet, 50% of the traces at today's current levels in the upper basin, the flow will drop below 82.5. At future demands, it'll go below 82.5. At 11 million, you go down to about 75. Now, there's some assumptions in here that you got to make if you're a modeler, and we all know all models are wrong, just some are useful. I hope this one's useful, and I'll just leave you with this. For 11 years, from 2012 to 2022, the natural flow of the river was closer to 11 than it was 13. Thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I'm going to interrupt here just for a second. Are you able to hear in the back? Yes? Good. Okay. I just implore everyone to remember to be pretty close to the mic.
Thanks, Terry. Thanks, Eric. That was great. Really appreciate the opportunity to be with you all here today. So I've been asked to talk about the federal tools that are available currently and those that are in the works, so to speak. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this slide and talking about some of the existing federal tools. And really fundamental and foundational to the operation of the basin are the 2007 guidelines. They were put together very smartly by someone on this stage, using the best available science and best available engineering at the time. I'm going to come back to that, but they were put together in a collaborative manner in a very smart way. Those operational guidelines provided stability for the region, the entire region, the Colorado River Basin region. They provided the underpinnings of commitment to cooperative solutions over the past number of years. That, along with the willingness of states, tribes, NGOs, and other partners to find common solutions, really wouldn't be possible without those operating guidelines and the things I'm going to talk about here today. Since the beginning of the operational guidelines in 2008, several new agreements were put in place in response to the conditions in the basin. We all are very familiar with most of those. They also provided an opportunity for several studies to be conducted. Up on the top of this chart are several of those items that were put in place that will expire after 2026. First and foremost is Minute 323, and I'll talk a little bit more about Mexico here in a minute, but Minute 323 to the 1944 treaty. The drought contingency plans and the binational water scarcity contingency plans also expire at the end of 2026. And of course, the interim guidelines themselves expire. Several items survive, those listed on the bottom, and I'll get into a little bit more of those in future slides. And then there's several items on the right-hand side of the slide that are in the works, so to speak. There's the process to develop a supplemental environmental impact statement and operational rules to supplement, as the name means, those 07 guidelines. There's a parallel process ongoing with Mexico to develop a minute to be a companion to those supplemental environmental impact statement operating rules. There's the post-2026 process that we'll get into here in just a minute, and then another parallel minute. And then the programs that we've set up for upper basin and lower basin system conservation and efficiency. Before I go to the next slide, I just wanted to draw your attention to the bottom box. Many of you in this room have been involved in the items listed in the bottom box that were also enabled by the 07 guidelines. The Basin study, which came out in 2012, the Moving Forward study, which came out in 2015, the Tribal Water study, which came out in 2018, and the 7D report assessing the effectiveness of the guidelines came out in 2020. All that was set up as part of the 07 guidelines. So let's turn to focus on the last 3 items on that chart. First, the revised draft supplemental environmental impact statement that's going on right now. As I mentioned, the 07 guidelines were rooted in the best available science at the time. We now know, based on real-time experience and new science and new climatology and an understanding of climate change and aridification, that the guidelines currently don't sufficiently reduce operational risks. We started realizing that after the adoption of the guidelines, and we reacted to that, putting measures in place, again, including Minute 323, the drought contingency plans, pilot system conservation, other conservation measures to deal with that. So let's rewind the tape to August of 2022. Our August 24-month study came out. It showed us we were going to be in a Tier 2A shortage for the first time ever. In November of 22, in response to the conditions on the river, we determined we needed to provide an overlay or a supplement to those 07 guidelines to get us through to the end of 2026. So we published a notice of intent to prepare a supplemental environmental impact statement. We published a draft in April. We had a no action alternative and 2 action alternatives. The hydrology that we used was in September of 2022, so shortly after the August 24-month study. Our wet year didn't materialize as of yet. In May of 2023, we received a consensus-based alternative from the lower basin, and we decided to analyze that. And we determined, based on the updated hydrology and the commitments made in the consensus-based alternative, that the risks were sufficiently reduced as compared to what our action alternatives 1 and 2 provided, and we published a new draft environmental impact statement, supplemental impact statement, in October. The public comment period for that document closed earlier this week, and we expect to publish a record of decision in early 2024. So that decision that we're going to publish in 2024 will get us through to the end of 2026. So again, we're back at the table needing to develop coordinated operational rules for Lake Powell and Lake Mead. So we published a pre-scoping Federal Register notice in June of 2022. In June of 2023, we published a notice of intent to prepare a new EIS, and just in this past October, we published a proposed federal action and a scoping report. The proposed federal action is really meant to provide for the sustainable management of the Colorado River system under a wide range of potential futures. Sustainable to me means meaningful reductions and bold actions to address severe yet very plausible future hydrology. We can't be back at the drawing table in a couple of years after publishing a new draft or new EIS and operational guidelines. So we need to look and get very creative about how we manage the basin. We don't want to preclude looking upstream or downstream of Lake Powell and Lake Mead. We need to look at conservation, augmentation, demand management, and other water management strategies in order to have robust guidelines. And robust to me means innovative and flexible and improves the predictability of water availability and enhanced opportunities for conservation. So where are we now in the process? We're in the alternatives development process. What was really kicked off with the publication of the proposed action. I'll talk a little bit about that on the next slide. We intend to work with folks in this room over the next several months to help develop those alternatives with the goal of publishing a draft environmental impact statement by the end of this coming calendar year. So a little bit about the alternatives development process. As I said, we need to develop a broad range of reasonable alternatives for robust operating guidelines. Our intention is to collaborate again with you all and provide technical assistance in the development of those guidelines, or those alternatives, excuse me. Whether they're components of alternatives or full-blown alternatives, we stand ready to work with folks in that development. And to aid in the development, we're really proud of the work that our technical folks have done, led by Rebecca Smith, who's at the booth, I believe, right now in the exhibit hall, explaining and exploring with folks our web tool that we developed. The web tool is something that we really encourage folks to take a look at, and running different alternatives, different scenarios, turning different knobs, looking at a full range of 8,000 different hydrologies. The web tool is the full CRSS model with under the hood, if you will, is Riverware. It's the same tool that we are going to use to develop the alternatives as we publish them in the draft EIS. So definitely spend some time and take a look at that tool. I mentioned earlier the binational process. There are several activities that we're undertaking in the Colorado River Basin that we call parallel activities. The parallel activity here on this particular slide, again, is our minutes to the 1944 treaty, which provides the country of Mexico, the two states in the country of Mexico, 1.5 million acre feet. So minutes, as most folks know, address implementation issues of the 1944 treaty. Minute 323 was one of those, really a companion to the drought contingency plan, a parallel process to the drought contingency plan. So we're in the process right now using the relationships and the technical expertise that was developed over several decades with the country of Mexico to provide new minutes, one a companion to the SCIS that will have conservation measures in it, and then one ultimately as a companion to the new post-2026 guidelines, which will undoubtedly have conservation measures associated with it. The final slide that I have is on historic investments and other tools that we have, also a parallel process. Reclamation has $13 billion combined with the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, $8.3 billion, and the Inflation Reduction Act, $4.6 billion. I want to say a little bit about how we're looking at these two laws and the appropriations that they provide. Often in the past, we set up programs that were meant to do more with the same amount of water. And that's an important tool to have. Absolutely, we need to become more efficient, doing more with the same amount of water. But what we're currently faced with the hydrology in the system, climate change, aridification, prolonged drought, is the need to do the same with a less amount of water, and in some other cases, less with a less amount of water. So we've structured this program to address all three of those. the programs under the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act. We've awarded so far $2.5 billion for 375 projects, the majority of which are in the Colorado River Basin. We've conserved so far with agreements in the spirit of doing the same with less and less with less, nearly 2 million acre feet of conservation activities to be executed very soon. 1.2 are complete, and then we have 800,000 more coming very soon. And with the commitment from the lower basin, we'll have another 1 million acre feet on top of that, in addition to conservation in Mexico under Parallel Minute. We're in the process of standing up what we call Bucket 2, these longer-term durable projects to use less water, keep more of those molecules, if you will, in the system, whether behind Hoover Dam, behind Powell, or above Powell, looking at ways where we can provide what we call new wet water accruing to the benefit of the system by virtue of the investments that we're making. So with that, I'll conclude, and thanks a lot for listening.
Again, my name is Amy Haas, and I am with the state of Utah. I'm here today, as Terry mentioned, to speak about the Upper Basin Drought Contingency Plan. It is a pleasure to be up here with my esteemed colleagues. This is an iconic photo. Many of us have seen it. 2019, so near yet so far. And to be fair, the DCP negotiation really occurred in 2018, the summer of 2018 to be exact, when at least a few of my colleagues up here on this panel spent the better part of our summers holed up in airport hotel conference rooms, hammering out what would then become the Upper and Lower Basin drought contingency plans. Now, from an Upper Basin perspective, 2 agreements were ultimately negotiated. The Demand Management Storage Agreement, which very generally allows for the storage of conserved water at Lake Powell and the other initial units, if necessary, for the Upper Basin to continue to satisfy its obligations under the 22 Compact. And also the Drought Response Operations Agreement, or DROA, which is an agreement between the 4 Upper Division states and the Secretary, acting through Reclamation, which basically provides for the release of water from the upstream initial units to shore up Lake Powell elevations. Because the Upper Division states have yet to implement demand management on a basin scale, my focus today is on DROA and the lessons learned since it was first deployed in 2021. And I have to say at the outset, this seating arrangement really works in my favor because I've got Eric Kuhn here as a buffer between David and myself, or maybe as a human shield, right? No, I'm kidding. It's really not going to be that bad. You know, at its essence, the objective of DROA is to protect Lake Powell from falling below a minimum target elevation of 25 feet in order to buffer Powell from falling to the critical elevation of 3490, or minimum power pool. This is achieved first by considering any operational adjustments or flexibilities at Glen Canyon Dam, and second, through the release and subsequent recovery of water from the upstream initial units of Flaming Gorge, Aspinall, and Navajo to Lake Powell. Now, there are 3 primary goals of any DROA operation. The first is continued compact compliance on the part of the Upper Division states. The second is continued hydropower generation. And the third is basically to minimize adverse effects to infrastructure and resources. And that is what has essentially been the goal of DROA operations since 2021. DROA sets forth what those of us who drafted it thought was a fairly deliberate process prior to initiating a DROA operation based on 24-month study projections, along with a provision recognizing the Secretary's authority to take emergency action and basically leapfrog over this process if there is an imminent need to protect the target elevation. And that emergency provision, I think it's fair to say, was something that we thought we were reserving for the most extreme situation. So lo and behold, the first action under DROA was by the Secretary in July of 2021, following a most probable 24-month study projection that Powell would reach 3525 the following March. So the Secretary released 161,000 acre-feet to Lake Powell from both Flaming Gorge and Blue Mesa reservoirs. Then, in January 2022, the Secretary, through Reclamation, undertook a second DROA action by reducing monthly releases from Lake Powell in the amount of 350,000 acre-feet. Later in 2022, and this time actually following the process laid out in DROA, a third operation was initiated consisting of a planned release of 500,000 acre-feet from Flaming Gorge, as well as further adjustments to Glen Canyon Dam releases. But this time, we weren't trying to protect that target elevation of 3525. We had blown through it. Rather, we were trying to avoid falling to or below 3490. However, in March of 2023, releases from Flaming Gorge were suspended in light of improved hydrology. Currently, the exclusive focus of DROA is on the recovery of all of the water previously released pursuant to it between 2021 and 2023, or approximately 453,000 acre-feet from Flaming Gorge and 36,000 acre-feet from Blue Mesa. So, has DROA achieved what it was intended to? Yes and no. The yes part. DROA has been an effective tool in protecting critical elevations at Lake Powell. This was especially true in 2023, when combined with good runoff, DROA added between 45 and 50 feet to Powell, and these planned future releases from Flaming Gorge were discontinued. The no part, and here is where DROA fails. If water released under a DROA operation with the goal of protecting infrastructure or hydropower at Powell is not accounted for separately, Powell will suffer, ultimately implicating or frustrating the intent of DROA. So, water year 2023 is a prime example of this. The presence of water released pursuant to DROA at Lake Powell, combined with that good hydrology I referenced, pushed us into a balancing situation. It also triggered recovery operations under DROA to replace that previously released water at Flaming Gorge and Blue Mesa. However, by the time balancing was completed at the end of the water year, recovery was not. Therefore, more balancing occurred than would have otherwise. And ultimately, about 8.58 million acre-feet was released from Powell in water year 2023. And that release was calculated based on total storage, including DROA water at Powell. Had the balancing calculation been based on system storage only and not included DROA, 8.45 million acre-feet would have been released, which is approximately 130,000 acre-feet less than what was in fact released. Now, 130,000 acre-feet is not a nominal amount of water, and to put it into context, it's roughly the amount Utah's largest single diverter is able to divert on average each year, and it's more than 3 times the amount of conservation generated by the Upper Basin in the System Conservation Pilot Program in 2023. Moreover, because DROA water at Powell was factored into the balancing release, a 130,000 acre-foot hole was left at Lake Powell. Put a little bit differently, Powell is 130,000 acre-feet lower than it would have been had DROA not occurred. You can see the contrast on this slide. So on the left, what actually occurred with Powell contents in light blue, and on the right, Powell storage 130,000 acre-feet higher had the release been based on system storage only, which is represented by that top hatched line. Because of this net negative impact to Powell, last September at a special meeting of the Upper Colorado River Commission, the 4 state commissioners adopted a resolution conditioning their approval of future releases under DROA on 3 principles when the goal of the release is to protect critical infrastructure or hydropower at Lake Powell. The first is water released to Powell must be retained there until full recovery is achieved upstream. Secondly, DROA water at Powell cannot result in greater releases from the reservoir than would have occurred without DROA. And finally, DROA operations cannot make Lake Powell worse off than it would have been without DROA. You know, I'd also like to recognize the support of Utah's water users and the Upper Basin tribes for their support with respect to these 3 principles regarding DROA. Like most everything else, DROA expires in 2026. There's a reasonable chance, reasonable given the hydrology and some of the projections at this point, although not a guarantee, that we won't have any more releases under DROA between now and its expiration. But perhaps most importantly, the post-2026 proposed federal action includes temporary emergency response operations at upstream Colorado River reservoirs to protect critical infrastructure at Glen Canyon Dam consistent with the existing records of decision. So if we see something DROA-like in the post-2026 operations, that water, in my opinion, must be accounted for separately to avoid injury to Lake Powell, similar to what occurred this year. You know, and I'd also like to say that notwithstanding the outsized role Flaming Gorge has played in DROA, the way that DROA water has been accounted is not just a Utah thing, it's not just a Wyoming thing. Rather, it's a basin-wide thing, in particular because its impacts on Lake Powell. And then finally, and maybe most importantly, there's a reason that these operations and agreements are interim, right? We implement them and we learn. DROA has been an important learning exercise, and now we know how DROA can work better, especially if DROA or something like it transcends 2026. Thank you.
Try and move this up. It sounds like I'm heard, which is fantastic. My name is Patrick Dent, and I'm certainly grateful to have a few moments to be part of the panel today and talk about the tools that have been put in place in the lower basin over the last decade or so to help prop up Lake Mead and address our declining river. And that's been talked about both by Eric, David, and by Margaret when we got started earlier today. I know when I walked in to hear Margaret's talk as we were kicking off CRWUA this afternoon, the back 4 or 5 rows of this room were pretty full, and the front ones not so much. And there were $100 bills on the chairs up here, and I just wanted to let you know that those who got here early to get on the back, you may have missed out. I'm really glad to be here today. I want to talk a little bit about, like I said, the tools in the lower basin, and focus on really the contributions to Lake Mead. Again, going back about over a decade, there have been a variety of programs that have been put in place to help address the drought on the Colorado River. Many of you in this room have been part of these agreements, either as water users, elected officials, employees, or policy folks at the different irrigation districts or Indian tribes or municipalities that have participated. And so I would start by acknowledging this has certainly been a group effort, and many of you are to be commended for the work that's been done here. To focus on a few of the tools, just to get a little bit of understanding on them, I've provided this kind of cumulative look over the last 10 years of how much water has been retained in Lake Mead. and tried to color code, and I'll start up from the bottom here and talk about the building blocks. And David mentioned a few of those in his remarks today, and the programs that Reclamation has worked on and is working on, and they are certainly an integral part of what I consider a success over the last 10 years. So we first have the 2007 guidelines, 2022 being the first shortage year that was implemented, and then of course we dropped into a Tier 2A this year, increasing the shortage volume. The guidelines set a framework of mandatory reductions that water users have to implement, and those have been implemented largely within the Central Arizona project, but others have taken direct reductions to their contract entitlements. In addition to the guidelines and the mandatory reductions that were required, there are other voluntary contributions that were put in place. Most of these started back earlier in the period as we were beginning to grapple with the severity of this drought. There was a memorandum of understanding between the Central Arizona Project, the Southern Nevada Water Authority, and the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California to implement a best efforts program to implement water in and put water into Lake Mead. Some of those were agreeing not to divert some of the water that they had available under their contracts without compensation, and leave the water in the reservoir for the benefit of others, and agreeing not to take that water out if it was unused in a particular state. System conservation water, has marked there in green, has been a component. As David mentioned, that was beginning with the pilot system conservation program early on in the period, and that has certainly evolved as a number of agencies have entered into system conservation agreements over the last 10 years, and those have certainly been amplified both with the 500 plus plan a couple of years ago, and as David was mentioning earlier in his remarks, the Inflation Reduction Act funding and the additional agreements that are being put in place this year, adding to water that contributes directly to Lake Mead, and a number of water users across the lower basin have contributed to that. There are the contributions required by the Drought Contingency Plan and DCP, and those began once DCP was implemented, beginning in 2020, and have been an additive contribution to the reservoir over that period. And then lastly, the intentionally created surplus, or ICS provisions, have put water in Lake Mead as water users within water contractors within the lower division states have implemented conservation activities which allowed them to put water in the reservoir, and under some circumstances they have committed to leave that water in the reservoir through 2026, and in other circumstances that water is available for withdrawal. I think there are different contractors who have different objectives with their ICS water. I know in Arizona, our ICS was a key component of help getting the drought contingency plan implemented as we worked to get DCP across the line in the 2018-2019 timeframe. Part of the transition for those additional reductions was the withdrawal of those ICS programs. At the same time, Arizona water users felt that it was important that we not remove water from the system as those ICS withdrawals were planned. And so an additional program, an offset program, was put in place. Additional monies were put forward within the state of Arizona. Additional Arizona water users brought water to the table to contribute in a system conservation fashion so that the lake didn't see a net negative effect. In the Metropolitan service area, generally their ICS account is trending upward. They use that water resource to be available in the driest times as they have multiple sources of supply, but overall it's a net add to the Colorado River system, and as we're trending this year we'll see many of those ICS accounts near full as we end 2023. So those are the main tools. I think the bottom line is the reduction in consumptive use among the lower basin contractors. Full allocations between the three lower division states are 7.5 million acre feet, as Eric indicated in his presentation. And you can see the downward trend over that same period as these programs have been implemented, with 2023 being below 6 million acre feet of anticipated consumptive use in the lower basin. Again, I would try to acknowledge just briefly before I pass the microphone over to Greg that this has been a lower basin wide effort in these programs. It's been a collaborative effort. It's been one that's required elected officials and boards to put money up, to say yes to sometimes very difficult decisions about what to do with their water supply. Tribes, agricultural interests, and cities likewise have made choices to participate in these programs and prop up Lake Mead. And while there is still much work to be done to address a declining river, I think many in this room and beyond the reach of my voice should be commended for their activities and the hard work that went into standing up these programs and propping up the Colorado River. Thank you.
Thanks, Patrick. In the blink of an eye, in the mid-19th century, the United States goaded Mexico into a turf war. And the result of that turf war was a treaty in 1848 by which the United States took more than 55% of the landmass of Mexico. Interestingly, that landmass included all of the Colorado River Basin states and the Republic of Texas at the time, which had declared independence as well, plus a tiny chunk of Nebraska for some reason. But what is remarkable about that is that what's on the slide here is demonstrably true, which is no nation in the world has had a greater impact on the daily lives of average Americans than Mexico. And the reverse is equally true. When I first started working on Mexico water issues, the only thing I knew about Mexico is what I learned on junkets to Tijuana from San Diego before that. And I thought it prudent to maybe read a little bit. So I asked a smart solicitor that I knew, is there a book or something I might read to help me? And he referenced or recommended this book by Jeff Davidow, who was the ambassador to Mexico between the Clinton and Bush administrations. The book was probably not a great commercial success. I still go to the library every once in a while, and I actually checked this one out. It was checked out 3 times since 2002, and I've checked it out twice. So I'm kind of wondering who else is interested in this relationship. But the book really went into the notion that we need to be more inclusive, better communicators with Mexico, and more transparent. And through the time of this publication, which was 2002, the relationship on the river wasn't what it was today. It was, in fact, quite adversarial, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a second. So as we moved past the guidelines themselves, and I was asked to cover the tools we've developed since the guidelines were implemented, Minute 316 was really the first minute where we had NGOs participate. And I wanted to call them out specifically here. What this minute did was strip out 38,000 acre feet from the Welton Mohawk bypass for treatment by YDP over a 1-year period, and that water was to be replaced with water delivered to the bypass that was contributed by Mexico, the U.S., and NGOs who had been working with the irrigation districts in the Mexicali Valley to help conserve water there. Just before, in the lead up to this minute, as I said, the countries were adversarial. Mexico had actually petitioned the Ninth Circuit in the All-American Canal case, in conflict certainly with what the United States wanted and had done. And so this represented a big shift in terms of how they were dealing with each other. And NGO participation, as noted here, was first. What we've seen from NGOs since, through minute 319 and 323, has been critical, I would say imperative to our success. So they've added publicity, funding, water sourcing, building trust on the ground in Mexico, social acceptance, social connections, and mitigating consequences of reductions in the system. All of these things have been crucial since that time, and we expect them in post-2026 as well. So moving to minute 317, what occurred there? The biggest change in this minute was the action by the states. Up to this point, the states really weren't included in the discussions. We kind of forced our way in 2010 to help be part of the discussion through what was called the Binational Cooperative Council. This minute has been called the most important minute that didn't prescribe anything by that same solicitor, who will go unnamed. But what we take from this, in addition to the state participation, was the willingness of IBWC in both countries to allow work groups into the tent, and those work groups would bring varying substantive help to hydrology, environment, new water sources, conservation, storage, etc. And it was an important minute for that reason, and it described the cooperative framework that we now have in place going forward. So minute 318 was the first minute in which Mexico was able to store water in the US. And what happened here was the earthquake in April of 2010 in the Mexicali Valley had destroyed a very large swath of land and approximately 400 miles of distribution infrastructure and canals. So what Mexico was able to do here was save water in the US that would otherwise have not had a purpose and would have been accounted for under the treaty as delivered. This ultimately was extended through minute 319 so that Mexico could continue to fix the infrastructure that was damaged by the earthquake. So you all remember minute 319, that was in 2012. The way I describe this minute is it was pretty much new and awesome and newsworthy throughout the world. But I'll point out three things. First, our counterparts in Mexico were in the middle of a federal administration changeover. Often in Mexico, no major federal action can occur during that lame duck period between the election and the sitting president. Here, however, the leaders in Mexico were insistent with their own government that we were going to finish this deal before the end of the year, and it got done. That kind of trust is important as we go forward. Two, shortage sharing. Under the treaty, Mexico is guaranteed 1.5 million acre feet. That is the highest order of guarantee that you can get in a contract. It's a treaty with the United States. Consequently, Mexico could have said no. We would have been forced to litigate it perhaps, but Mexico agreed to share in a shortage based on the elevations of Lake Mead. And three, the third thing to take away from minute 319 is that the U.S. was able to fund conservation projects in Mexico that otherwise would not have been done. And the benefit of those projects long-term resides in Mexico, largely their canal relinings and that kind of thing that will last for 30 or 40 or 50 years. So while Mexico gets the long-term benefit, the U.S. gets the short-term benefit and is able to find funding to make some of those things happen. And that was done through the projects work group. Finally, minute 323. I'll just call it minute 319 plus. And what we saw here was, in addition to all the things that minute 319 did that were awesome and newsworthy around the world, Mexico agreed ahead of time to store water in the U.S. system to the extent that the United States would ultimately do the same thing. So it was willing to put some skin in the game and be a full partner. It essentially pushed some chips into the pot and hoped that we came through, and we did. And it's a statement about the relationship between the two countries and the players involved in those discussions that Mexico was willing to do that. And obviously we need that kind of trust and that relationship carried forward. So the major takeaways currently, I'd say three things. They're noted on the screen that we need the NGOs, the states, and the contractors to have roles in the discussion with Mexico going forward. Subject matter experts can help solve technical, legal, and political questions, which we've seen throughout the project or throughout the work group processes that we've implemented. And Mexico has been, is, and must remain a true partner in these discussions. As we look forward to 2026 and the rules that will be in place between the two countries after that, and we think about the relationship as we face the daunting climate change challenge. It's really not about what that relationship is. It's not about what it was. It's what about it must be. And we are one set of users. They're absolutely dependent upon the health of the system, and we need to continue to find ways to build the relationship with Mexico as true partners. Thank you.
All right, thank you all. So I'm going to go ahead and ask the other panel members to please make their way up here and fill in the seats. And while they're doing that, let me just tell you what our format will be. We're going to have a discussion here, essentially a question and answer discussion. Unfortunately, we're not set up to take questions from you all in the audience. Apologize for that. Mainly it's a time constraint. But I know everyone on the panels would be quite willing to talk to you in the halls here, which is the CRWUA way anyway, I think. So with that said, I want to just say one thing in regard to Eric's sports analogy. I think the best analogy for this year is the Denver Broncos. They turned it around, right? So we can turn it around. Mother Nature can turn it around. All right. Well, if you're not a Bronco fan, you don't know the misery we lived through for those first 6 to 7 games, but it's changed now. Okay. There's a chair here. I won't sit here.
We're good.
Very good. Now do we have enough? Great.
Go back now.
Yeah, bet. Okay. We have our musical chairs game played. So let me introduce our speakers or discussion panelists for this second panel. And I won't know exactly where you're sitting, so I'll just start here in alphabetical order. First, Lorelei Cloud. Lorelei serves as the vice chairman of the Southern Ute Indian Tribe and has an unwavering commitment to safeguarding the tribe's water resources and ensuring equitable management for their future generations. Adel HageKhalil. Maybe I'm close, Adel. He's the general manager and chief executive officer for MWD, the largest wholesale drinking water supplier in the country that provides water to 26 member public agencies serving 19 million people in Southern California and supports a $1.9 trillion economy. Edalin Koziol. Close. All right, my biggest test of all was the names. Edalin's a senior policy advisor for the Nature Conservancy's Colorado River program and is sitting in for Taylor Haas, the TNC's Colorado River program manager, who is not able to be with us today. So thanks a lot, Edalin. Stephen Rowe Lewis. Governor Lewis, is about to start his 4th term as the governor of the Gila River Indian Community, and as governor of the community, he has brought innovative solutions to long-standing issues, including supporting water efficiency projects to reduce the community's reliance on Colorado River water. And Andy Mueller. Andy's the general manager of the Colorado River District, a regional government charged with protecting, developing, and conserving the waters of the Colorado River and its tributaries for the benefit of the inhabitants of the district, and with assisting the state of Colorado in protecting Colorado's apportionment of the Colorado River. Okay, so what we did, as I mentioned it briefly, we asked each other some questions, put them together in some themes, and we're just going to start off on these themes. I'll start by asking a specific question or two to individuals, and then allow the panel to have any discussion they would wish. I'll be the keeper of the time, and we'll just get as far as we can in the time we have left, which is about 50 minutes, I think. All right, so let's start with the management tools themselves. You heard presentations from both Amy and Patrick. And I'll ask a question for Amy. In light of the many efforts to manage a dwindling water supply over the last 23 years, what measures have been both the most effective and the most problematic from an Upper Basin perspective, and how would you apply those lessons learned to post-2026?
Can you hear me? If it's not on, do I have to answer the question? I'm kidding. Can folks hear me? Am I okay? Great.
You told me you would answer this question. I don't know.
Well, I promise. I promise. I'm going to transpose it, though, if you don't mind. It's always easier to talk about what didn't work.
Yes, that's
I don't
fine.
know,
You
glass
bet.
half full, something like that. So, not surprisingly, from an Upper Basin standpoint, I think the 07 guidelines really haven't worked to plan, I think. And, you know, among my greatest hits list, I was going to use the same example that Eric Kuhn did, which is that spate of 5 years running of 9 million acre feet releases from Lake Powell. But because you scooped me on that, Eric, you probably saw my list. There are, I think, myriad issues with the guidelines. The other is the guidelines and the operations under the guidelines are premised on forecasting 6 months out. Operations are premised on forecasts that are going to necessarily be inaccurate, right? I think we've got to get away from that model where we're relying on actual hydrology and storage in the 2 reservoirs to dictate operations. So I would say that that is a major shortcoming of the 07 guidelines. Now, what worked? I mentioned I'm not going to belabor the DROA conversation too much, except to say that I think DROA can work, and it did in part work, right? It was effective in protecting Powell elevations. I think the accounting was the shortcoming in terms of that. You know, the other thing I would say in terms of what worked and what is working in the Upper Basin is that, ironically, some of the failings, my perspective, of the 07 guidelines have really inspired the Upper Division states and the Upper Colorado River Commission to step up our technical game. And I think we have done that by building capacity over the last 4 to 5 years so that we are engaged in these negotiations from a technical standpoint more than ever before. We're not merely reacting, we're participating. And we saw that beginning with the SEIS and the development of a state's alternative. And we're currently seeing that in the development of a consensus, hopefully, knock on wood, a consensus Basin States alternative. So, again, I think out of that experience has come a positive, and that really goes to the technical capacity and prowess that we've developed. Thanks.
Good. Okay. Well, I'm going to ask a follow-up directly to Patrick, and then some question maybe for the general panel. But regarding the lower basin agreements and programs you've talked about, what elements or tools do you consider valuable, the most valuable, moving forward into 2026, particularly with a shrinking river?
Thank you, Terry. And I'll start by at least acknowledging in the affirmative a couple of the things that Amy had pointed about the 2007 guidelines with regard to forecasts and thinking about how we use our storage. In the tools that I talked about today, I think going forward, a number of those will be important. The existing guidelines set up a framework for mandatory reductions. I think that's something that we'll need going forward. A voluntary compensated program, I think, can be helpful in certain situations, so whether it be a short duration or something that needs to be responsive to hydrologic conditions that we're looking at. A storage program like the ICS program, I think, has a lot of value for water users to manage their use. And in years where there are situations where water supplies are available and can be stored, I think that's a good tool to help tighten up the operation of the river and provide flexibility for folks to conform around a smaller water supply. I would like to see us also look at augmentation and exchange provisions so that we can make this conversation not just about reductions on the river, but also find ways to provide for investment and development of water supplies to meet needs. And then to the extent, maybe this is going back to some of David's remarks, if there are opportunities for infrastructure improvement in the basin that can either improve the management, improve the way we use the water supply, that we should be conscious about how both long-term funding, authorizations, the things that we might need going forward to really sharpen our pencil on how well we operate the river and find ways for water users to help stretch the water supply that they will have available. Thanks, Terry.
You bet. So maybe a question for the panel. Of all of these management tools discussed, do you have a particular tool that you want to make sure we use in post-2026, have a part of it, or maybe one you want to make sure isn't a part of it? Anyone have a thought on that?
Well, Terry, I guess I wouldn't say it's a tool.
It's fine.
I would say hydrology,
Yeah.
period. Hydrology. We actually need to use real-time current hydrology as close as we can get to determine the consumptive use is available, the water that is available for everybody in the system. And we need to live within the hydrology.
Okay, very fair. Let me add one thing, maybe to, for those who weren't involved back in those days, one of the reasons that was debated and talked about for using forecasts was to give water users some advance notice, particularly with regard to shortages. I think our valuable operating experience, as Amy pointed out, has shown us that that's not that necessary, perhaps. But let me look to Greg, for instance. What do you all, as with your experience of managing for shortages, feel about that in terms of, do you need a few months advance notice to know you have a shortage, or is January 1st just fine?
Yeah, thanks, Terry. I guess I would say I'm not sure how much it matters. We went through combined storage about 40 million acre feet over the last 20 years in overuse, right? So whether it's 6 months out or immediately reacting to hydrology, I'm not sure that's the ticket as much as getting that balance squared away by any means. So we want that first and foremost. And I do think that what Pat talked about in terms of having some flexibility created through storage is critical. And I'll give you an example real quickly, which is part of the driver for the conservation efforts that you probably get sick of hearing about in Southern Nevada is the fact that we can store that water. It'd be a lot harder to do without it. We are obviously planning for rules that may run the gamut, but the ability to store and have some type of bank account is helpful. I'll just leave it at that.
Okay, very good. What about other management options? And I'll use that term tools quite loosely here. But management options such as assessing for lower basin evaporation losses. That's been something that's been in the news and people have been talking about a lot. It comes with a plethora of thorny issues. But any panel members willing to venture their opinions on looking into that and potentially considering it?
Let me just start by saying thank you for being here. It's a, one of the previous question you asked for how much time we need to react. You cannot just react in a short period of time. That's why you need long-term planning and long-term action, and you need to adapt to a changing climate, but you can't be doing it on the fly. You can't, but we need science, we need data to understand how much water we have in the snowpack, how dry is the condition, so you know how much runoff we have. That's part of the modeling, and those are things that we're doing in California now, trying to improve understanding how much water we're going to have in the future. But I want to talk about really we know we have a deficit, structural deficit in our water. I mean, how much is rivers yielding versus how much is being used, whether it's for evaporation or something else for losses. I think the lower basin have agreed that we want to take on the structural deficit and address that, and that's critical. But I think what we need to be talking about, I know this is really my thing that I'm advocating for, is we keep fighting over cuts. We keep fighting over reducing our use, which I agree we need to live within our means. But I want to just turn the whole thing over its head and start thinking about how we prepare and adapt to the changing condition. We can't be victims to the hydrology. Our communities, our farmers, the environment cannot be victims to the climate whiplash and the hydrology that can come on us. We're not victims, so we need to adapt differently. And how we adapt? Through building, planning, through programs that we put in place, whether it's conservation. I mean, Patrick showed some slides that were powerful slides on how much Lower Basin has invested in reducing our consumption and increasing our storage. And this is what we need to be doing. This year alone, the Lower Basin is using 700,000 acre-feet less water. It's the lowest, I think, since 1949. Metropolitan by itself alone, over time, have invested a lot of money to put over 20 feet in Lake Mead, 1.6 million acre-feet of storage. And this year alone, we put 450,000 acre-feet of storage. But how does that happen? Through programs of conservation. You know, California has taken on, following the lead of Nevada in banning the watering of non-functional turf. We joined NRDC and Heal the Bay in co-sponsoring legislation in Sacramento to ban it, ban the watering of non-functional turf in institutional, commercial, and facilities. That's about 300,000 acre-feet of water in Southern California alone, in metropolitan service area. We are working hard on incentivizing people to convert their grass, but also, how can we build the infrastructure? Metropolitan is doing the climate adaptation master planning, and I see Liz Crossan leading the way, and my board is leading the way in planning it. But what we're looking for is, how can we store water when we have it across the system? You know, Metropolitan is lucky that we're in the middle of two watersheds, and we can bring water from, the Sierras and also from the Colorado River. And this year we were lucky, we were able to to bring water, more water from the Sierras, and we're able to push water into Lake Mead and Lake Powell. But I think building more conveyance to move water, building storage. We just, did a project up in Antelope Valley to do groundwater banking, 300,000 acre feet. We're building the largest recycled water project, and we're partnering with Nevada and Arizona on potentially building it. To me, we need to start thinking about how we start creating more water. I know cuts are important. We need to manage within our means. But I think we have communities that depend on water. We have farmers that depend on water. We have the environment that depends on water. We have tribes that need water. And we can't leave anyone behind. And the way we do it is create more abundance, right? Create more water. And the way you create more water is that we collaborate and start investing in projects that can help us all. Conservation, storage, enhanced conveyance that we can move water around and move it in the system. Recycling, groundwater remediation. I was talking to the Colorado River Indian tribe the other day. We had a meeting in our facility up in Lake Havasu. And we were talking about, they're interested in recycled water. They're interested in brackish water, restoration and treating it so they can put more water in Lake Mead when we have it. To me, I want to get to a place, building on the Inflation Reduction Act. I want to thank the Bureau and the administration on doing it, but that's a short term. It's not going to last forever. And I want to challenge all of us, Lower Basin and Upper Basin, Mexico and everyone, to say, how can we create not just reservoirs of water, reservoirs of money that's sustainable for the future, that we can invest in a smart, strategic ways to can put water in, through programs like conservation and recycling, all that program, so we can save water and back in Lake Mead. So when we have issues, we have drought conditions, we have hotter and drier days, none of us are looking for ways to fight each other and fight over that molecule of water. I think we need to be smart. I want to challenge everyone to do that. And it's going to take all of us sharing, not just Lower Basin. Upper Basin has to share. We'll take our share in terms of the structural deficit. We've committed to that. But beyond that, we all have to share. And isn't it better to share in building infrastructure, building recycled water? And some communities have invested a lot more and they're not needing the water. And maybe there's exchanges. So I think I want to challenge us to start thinking a little bit differently, not just talk about cuts and dealing with the hydrology that we're victims to it, versus control our own destiny. That's what my board wants me to do. That's what Metropolitan is doing. That's what we think we've done in the Lower Basin, and we need to do it together. So I'm optimistic, and otherwise, I think we need to all be optimistic, energetic, and ready to go. But it's not going to be the same old tools that we had in the past. We need to find new tools, and it takes a lot of collaboration, a lot of creative ideas.
Governor Lewis. Thank you, Adel.
Yeah, thank you. And I agree with the approach moving forward for my colleague here. The community, I think we all understand that evaporation loss is a very thorny issue. But in the community, though, we support at least exploring a way where we can see these potential cuts at least shared equitably in the Lower Basin. But it has to be equitably, in an equitable way, or else, at least for the community, with our substantial water supply, and how we really want to put this to use, and we are putting it to use as well. And we are looking at ways where we can, I think, for all of us, I think this is a moment for big ideas. We're not going to be able to cut ourselves, for these cuts are going to cut ourselves out of this existential moment along the Colorado River. We have to look at new sources of water as well among the states. For the community, we're looking at ways where we're looking beyond, and in fact, we were proud of the partnership with the Bureau of Reclamation, with our federal partners, in regards to conservation agreements, but also looking at bucket 2 proposals as well. But still, bucket 2 proposals aren't going to get us there as well. We have to look beyond bucket 2 proposals. We have to really, really look ahead in ways where we can look at very, I would say, visionary proposals. The community, we're proud of leading the way in these certain areas, of whether we're lining our canals. We have over 200 miles of canals along within the Gila River Indian community. We just broke ground on of such an innovative project, solar panels over canals. It's the Gila River Indian community, a tribal sovereign nation, that is the first one to break ground in the Western Hemisphere on solar panels over canals to address evaporation and to generate green renewable energy as well. We're looking at this as our blue-green economy strategy in addressing this existential moment, Terry. And so, when tribes are at the table, when we're at the table, I'm glad I have a seat here on the panel, thank you. But when tribes are at the table, we can bring those innovations. And so, we're looking at ways where we can either start to lead the way. We have an award-winning managed aquifer recharge systems, our MARPS program as well, where we're recharging water, we're storing water as well. And when tribes are at the table, they can bring those innovations, and they have those big ideas. Terry, thank you.
Thank you. So, with regard to tribal involvement, I know coming out of the guidelines, we deservedly were disappointed, I think, from the tribal perspective as well as our perspective with regard to that involvement. I'll turn this one to Lorelei. Are we doing better this time in terms of involving the tribes as we start to talk seriously about what we're going to do post-2026?
It's a great question, Terry. I think we are doing better this year. I do have to say, since the 1922 compact, again, tribes were not involved. It's not until 1924 that tribes became citizens of the United States. So next year, 100 years for tribes to be citizens in their own country, their own lands. So in 2023, we are doing a lot better than we have in quite a long time. I do think that it's important to have tribes, the inclusion for tribes in all of these conversations, because we are the first conservationists for this country. We know how to take care of the land. We know how to take care of the water. We know that there is a special connection between human nature, or between humans and Mother Nature. We understand that, and we're able to bring that perspective along with us to also help educate others on what that perspective is. So having an indigenous mind frame around these different concepts, or we say concepts, but it's a normal way of life for us as we. It's our everyday. What we do every day is we pray for our water. We pray to Mother Nature. But when we talk about the new interim guidelines, having tribes included in that process is going to be key. And we've gotten to a point right now to where we're able to have those conversations. I want those conversations to be normalized, where it's always going to be tribes at the table, and I don't want tribes to be an afterthought in those conversations. Again, we've done better in doing that. I also think that in order to get there, we really need to come to the reckoning of the past traumas and the past things that have happened to tribes, and get rid of those old narratives. When they talk about the Indian problem, we can't have that narrative anymore. Everybody needs to work together as a collective, because we're in this basin together. Tribes are not leaving, and so tribes need to be a part of those conversations. It's been a long time, I guess since 1922, we've been relying on unused tribal water for such a long time, and right now we cannot continue to allow that, especially like in the upper basin. The upper basin relies on hydrology, and I believe the lower basin should also rely on hydrology, on Mother Nature. It's going to be the only way that we're going to be able to work together. relying on unused tribal water cannot happen anymore. And we're finally coming to that point where we can speak in a room like this and talk about that. And so that's come a long way in getting to this point. So yes, we've come a long way. We have a lot more work to do though. And so I'm ready to roll up my sleeves and get to it.
I'm sure we do have a lot more work to do. Well, with regard to the reliance of the basin on unused tribal water, what kinds of thoughts are there from the panel in terms of how to deal with that?
For tribal water?
And pardon?
What was your question? Sorry.
This reliance that the basin has had on unused tribal water and the need to grapple with that. My question is, what kinds of ideas do we have to address that?
My first one is ensuring and formalizing the process of tribes being included in the 2026 interim guidelines. Formalizing tribes being at the table, regardless of the situation or whatever conversation is going on. Tribes are sovereign nations. They're sovereigns just like the federal government, just like the states, and they should be included in those conversations. And so that, I think, is going to be the biggest undertaking, is ensuring that and allowing tribes to determine how they're going to use their water and gain the access and to develop their water. You know, tribes, we say that we're protecting our tribal water rights, but the only way we're going to protect that is to develop our unused tribal water. And again, there's been a large reliance for such a long time about relying on that unused tribal water. So including tribes in those conversations. Tribes also need to get the funding and the access, the capacity, regardless, you know, maybe it's staff or whatever it may be, so that they can develop that unused tribal water. I know, like on my reservation, we have another situation. We have a Pine River Irrigation System, which is a Bureau of Indian Affairs project. It's 175 miles worth of 175 miles of canal systems, and it was put into place in the 1800s by the federal government. Yet they've never maintained their own system since the 1960s, but our tribal members still pay O&M fees since the 1960s for water that they have never received and probably never will until the federal government fixes their own system. So when you talk about tribes being able to develop their water and being part of the conversations, all of these different situations like this also have to be addressed at the same time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Amy.
See if I can get it right this time. I just want to add to Chairwoman Cloud's comments. There's a substantial amount of undeveloped but recognized tribal rights in the Upper Basin. Whatever the post-2026 criteria look like has to accommodate for these undeveloped rights and has to allow the tribes the opportunity to develop those rights.
Thank you, Amy. Others on the panel? Oh, I know.
Sorry,
It's all right.
his mic seems. I think we blew it. Can you hear me?
No. We can't, Amy.
Thank you, Adel. I want to state that, you know, the tribes have unused water, but they have tremendous needs for clean drinking water and better delivery systems. The acting chair and her tribe were kind enough to host our drought task force in our state on their reservation this fall. It is an abomination to see the Pine River Indian irrigation system down there. It is very poorly maintained, and want to say the tribe's not looking for handouts. They have invested tens of millions of dollars into maintaining that system of their own money. And in a world right now where our federal government is paying for temporary one-offs in the tunes of hundreds of millions of dollars for foregoing the use of water among non-Indian water users, our tribes are foregoing the use of their water, and they're not being compensated for that. And I think that examining that practice and understanding the structural racism that lies below that practice, and understanding that the water that the tribes are not using in the upper basin is actually being consumed by lower basin folks, and I would say some of the folks in the upper basin as well. And so the question I would ask of everybody in this community is, who should we be compensating, and how do we help rectify the fact that the disproportionate amount of our tribal members don't have access to clean drinking water, don't have proper irrigation systems and modern amenities with respect to water. And how do we, as members of this water community on a river that, and I agree with Adel, we are a community. We have to act as one, and we all have responsibilities to each other to not deprive each other of water. And I think we're making progress, as acting chair pointed out, and I think she's remarkably polite to do it in the way she has. But I think that we really do need to recognize that we are today compensating folks for water that may actually be the Upper Basin Tribe's water. So,
David.
Excuse me, thanks for the question, and thanks for all the panelists' responses to that question. I just wanted to ensure the panelists, as well as everybody in the audience, that Commissioner Tootin, the Biden-Harris administration, everybody in Reclamation is absolutely committed to taking on this issue of addressing unused tribal water, underdeveloped tribal water, water that has not yet been settled, as we move forward and do so in a way that's in concert with developing new guidelines. So that's absolutely fundamental. And there's a variety of tools that may come to bear through that process, and one of which is related to infrastructure, as you addressed, Andy. I think that's critically important. We just announced this week $16.5 million for tribal technical assistance that would help with that. We have $550 million that we're deploying under the Inflation Reduction Act for disadvantaged communities. We expect that the vast majority of that funding will go towards tribal disadvantaged communities, which are tribal, and addressing some domestic water needs. So we're absolutely committed to taking this issue on. It's been lingering for a long time and needs to be addressed. And we have resources now to help with some of the infrastructure, but we also know it's going to take a lot more resources, a lot more innovation moving forward to completely address this issue.
Okay. Thank you, David. Seeing no other hands, let's switch a little bit here to the environment. So certainly 100 years ago when the compact was signed, I don't believe the word environment was in it. We've come a long way, but my guess is we have a long way still to go. Edalin, is that true?
Yes. It's an easy one, short answer, yes. Going back to your first question about the tools that we've been using and what we would like to bring forward, or what we might want to change, I think, with respect to the environmental piece of the puzzle, I think that there are lessons that we have learned from using the tools. And one of those is that, we need to look at things much more holistically. There's, when you're talking about the long-term durability of the system or about system resilience, really the environment is the foundation of the system. We have to be working together towards solutions that help our communities, our farms, our industry, and the river adapt. And so when we're talking about resilience, we kind of have to take all of that into consideration.
So with regard to the existing environmental programs, are there things that you see that we need to ensure we don't take a step back from and always move forward, or anything in specific come to mind?
So, Terry, as you know, there are a bunch of Endangered Species Act excuse me, ESA programs across the basin. And I think that those on, across the basin, they've really done a lot to maintain the species that we've had. We've seen great successes, for example, in the upper basin programs. But, moving forward, we really do need to start looking at the environment as not just a stakeholder. It's not the endangered and threatened species. We need to be looking at the environment as the foundation for all of the uses in the system. And if we push the natural system to the brink, it's going to be so much harder for our communities to adapt. And, stepping back and looking at 2020 or 2021 as an example. 2021, we had 95% snowpack, average snowpack, and 33% runoff. And there were incredible wildfires in the upper basin. The wildfire season extended into October, which was unheard of. But what we're seeing is just the soils are drier, the atmosphere is thirstier, and the forests are in such bad health right now that it's really impacting our runoff. And so we really need to be, I think, increasing our focus on these long-term watershed health and other types of resilience opportunities, and not just focusing on these individual problems. And, as some of the other panelists have mentioned, David especially, there are a lot of current investments and efforts right now to inject money into these types of programs. But there is still a really big need and an opportunity to build these types of resilience, or this type of resilience into the river system. The Nature Conservancy and some of our partners just actually released a report called Accelerating Investment in Resilience for the Colorado River Basin. And in this report, we outline some of the strategies and identify some of the current investments or current opportunities for investments that we think the BIL and IRA money provides opportunities to take advantage of. But essentially, we are at a point where if we are ignoring the resilience of the environment, it's going to make our job collectively as a community in addressing our water scarcity challenges that much harder. So the other side of this also, and this kind of goes back to the question that you were asking before, a lot of the solutions or a lot of the tools or a lot of the strategies and frameworks that we've been employing up until this point have been very focused on addressing one particular issue or a small set of issues. But we really, going forward, have to be embracing solutions and looking for those solutions together that create co-benefits. We're at the point, we don't have the luxury of, addressing one issue anymore. And we have to optimize every single drop of water. Yeah, no problem.
Is it people hearing okay? Just want to make sure. Okay.
Thanks. I will lean in. Thanks. So I was just saying that the solutions that we need to be embracing as a Colorado River water community really need to be emphasizing co-benefits. We are not in the situation anymore where we have the luxury of addressing one issue. Every single drop that we have in the river or in any of the river systems has to be working harder. And the conservation community has really tried to look for those opportunities. And right now we are working with the New Mexico Interstate Stream Commission and the Jicarilla Apache Nation on a project that we feel shows how this can be done at a scale that's really meaningful. TNC and the ISC have entered into an agreement with the nation to lease 20,000 acre feet over the next 10 years. And this benefits not only threatened and endangered fish species in the upper Colorado, it also increases water security for the state of New Mexico and its water users, and it also provides income for the nation and supports its economic self-sufficiency. So, as we are looking forward, looking towards the interim guidelines, the interim guidelines are going to be analyzing impacts to the environment from the alternatives, but I would argue that we actually need to go further than just looking at the impacts from other alternatives and start building environmental resilience and the resilience of our natural systems into not just the interim guidelines, but the other tools and the other frameworks and the other agreements that we are going to be contemplating as we move forward. Because, the challenges that we're facing, it's not just, yes, we have to reduce, and we are trusting that the states and other water users are looking at ways of how we are going to be reducing, but we have to be also thinking about how we're going to be doing it in a way that ensures the viability of our natural systems for people and for nature. Because, the river that we use, we depend on that river. The river that we depend on, it depends on us to help adapt as we are moving forward. And the Colorado River is often looked at across the world as an example of an arid system, and as we look forward to some of these new agreements, these new these new strategies that we're embracing, it's a question of whether it's going to be a situation, or we might be an example of the tragedy of the commons, or I would like to think that we could be a model of sustainability, and I think it really comes down to that question of how we are going to be incorporating the environment in these conversations.
All right, very good. So apologize if people couldn't hear all of that. I want to go back to make sure. So I think you gave us a homework assignment. So this report you mentioned, is that, would you say that again? And it's available on your website?
It is called Accelerating the Investment in Resilience for the Colorado River Basin at Resilient Co River, so resilientcoriver.org.
Very good. Okay, thank you. All right. Well, given especially the endangered species programs, and I'm going to look to someone in the lower basin to address this. The MSCP program, in my opinion, has been a model for an endangered species program that has the ability to adapt. And I think we've gone back and sought additional coverage at least once. And clearly with the kind of reductions that we're teeing up here needing to do, I'm sure that's probably a second time at least we'll go back for additional coverage. Greg, Patrick, Adel, anyone have a thought about how that's working in terms of being able to be adaptive to this terrible reduction in hydrology, but also then reductions in river flows that come out of our actions like conserving water?
All right, I'll try, Terry. I'm not that heavily involved in it, to be honest, but I'll say this. That program has withstood some challenges, legal and otherwise, and that's important. So it gives us coverage to do what we need to do, at least looking backwards. Looking forward, we do know that we are going to probably hit some triggers with some of these new cuts that we're talking about, and consequently we'll need some additional coverage. I would expect, because that program has been as successful as it's been, that we would probably get some legislation to make sure we've got that coverage. There will probably be other elements of any large package where we're probably in Congress anyway, so I suspect we're going to try to find a way using that vehicle. I know there's been some funding issues historically. We need to probably fix those as well. But I'll leave it up to my other panelists to add to that if they would like.
I'm happy to add a couple of thoughts, Terry. One of the great things about that particular program is the government to water user partnerships. And I know on my staff, it seems like they're meeting all the time on MSCP. That is something they really put a lot of effort into. And Greg is spot on with additional reductions. We might need additional coverage. And I think one of the great things about the program is that they're always working on it, and they're always working to have some foresight about here's where we see the river going, the things we need to work toward and implement, and then we have a good cross-section, a good cross-functional team working to make those changes. And there might be, as Greg just mentioned, legislative or financial challenges, but I think we're in as good a position as we could be to carry that forward and to meet the objectives of the program.
Okay, very good. Well, let me come back to a word that Adel and maybe a couple others use, augmentation. So if I think of the last time I really heard augmentation being considered on the Colorado Basin, and by considered I mean talked about, was probably the Basin study in 2012. So what's holding us back on those conversations? Could it be that the word augmentation always connotes a pipeline to a river basin or iceberg still being floated down from Alaska or whatever all those brainy things were that were thrown out there many years ago? What's holding us back from at least having the conversation? Or are we having the conversation? That I'm not, and I'm
I think
aware of it.
the answer should be we should have those conversations. We should have it. It's not. It needs to be at the table, and I think what sometimes holds us up is the funding. At least we have a shot in the arm from the federal government right now in the Inflation Reduction Act. We've submitted our proposal on Bucket 2 for some efforts, including storage, non-functional turf conversion, local water supply issues. But I'll give you just one example of what could have been done. In Metropolitan this year, until the end of December, we had 100% allocation from the state water project. I had 400,000 acre-feet of water that I couldn't move in the system because of limitation in conveyance capacity, right? We know we need to improve conveyance to allow me to move water and store the maximum amount of water when we have wet conditions. Maximize storage, we're trying to build ways to put water in, but conveyance is critical. If we were able to move that 400,000 acre-feet of water and put it and use it in the system in Southern California, that means 400,000 could have been backed into Lake Mead and Lake Powell for storage. And we could have shared in that cost of the conveyance improvements. Just a simple example, right? The same thing with recycled water. I mean, we can invest together on building recycled water where some of it can be dedicated to go into use that will offset the need for Colorado River that can be backed into the system to help shore up the needs and help satisfy the demands, but also it's for our rainy day kind of storage and fund. The biggest, I think, issue is first of all, we need to take the blinders and understand that we are a watershed together. We're not just individuals, we're a watershed. And allowing for exchanges. I'll tell you just one example that I'm proud of is the Bard Irrigation District by Yuma. We have a great partnership with the Kitsan tribe too that we're able to help them take some undeveloped water and figure out how we can take care of it. That's a great agreement. But Bard, we had seasonal, I would call seasonal farming, where they agreed to do some seasonal farming during the wintertime, but during the summer, they would not farm, and we would pay them the money equivalent to the water that we save and put in Lake Mead. what they do with that money is not only compensate farmers, but they use part of that money to line canals, to put efficiency systems, to build the technology they need to better operate the system. That's smart. It's not just lining pockets, we're lining canals, right? That's a great thing that we need to do. But I think to me, first of all, we need to take our blinders off and understand, investments in places like Southern California is an investment in the entire Southwest. Investments in Mexico is an investment in the Southwest. Investments in Arizona, investments in Southwest, investments in Colorado, the same thing, and how we can do it together. So that's why I think we need to come to a place where we understand we can't be just saying, you have to do it, it's your problem. I think we all have to step up and figure out how we can do it together. And my biggest issue at some point, it's all about money and how we share the money and how we invest. And if we can create some mechanism of sharing and bringing money together that we can invest strategically for the benefit of everyone, the community, the environment, the river, and the tribes, I think we can really move forward. So I think the whole thing is, one, we need to understand it's a single watershed. Second is how we can bring in resources beyond what's happening now with the Inflation Reduction Act.
Very good. Great.
I just wanted to add a couple things. I have three points. I think that first of all, it's a pain in the butt to build a big desal plant or recycling plant. It takes a lot of time. That's one. Two is they're very expensive, right? That's two. And three is that conservation is cheaper at this point. So what you're observing, I think, is we haven't squeezed out the sponge, to use the metaphor of one of my favorite gadflies that comes to our meetings, to the point where we're desperate enough to cut some red tape and build some plants. But ultimately, I think we'll have to get there. We have made the bet on Adel's recycling plant. We're willing to put $1 billion into that because we think it's a productive way to use resources, and it is helpful to the entire river system to do things like that. So we'll get there.
Very good. Okay, thank you. Greg, since you just left the microphone, let me ask you a question about Mexico. So you outlined that many good things have happened, and based on a very strong collaborative relationship, what's it going to take to continue that post-2026?
It's going to take the level of trust that we've built up in each other as we face incredible challenges, and it's going to take, we need to hold on to a couple things that we've developed. One is there's a very intelligent doctor that I know that created the first, what he called POTA, which is a point of tentative agreement. And Mexico, willing to put the treaty aside for the moment and not litigate what that emergency measure meant, was willing to say, look, we'll share in the pain, right? We'll share in the pain in proportion to what the U.S. takes in terms of a cut. And that's been absolutely critical. To me, it's a sign they are a true partner. We need to keep Mexico as a true partner. We can't sell them baked cakes, and consequently, we need to keep talking to them.
Very good. So I see we're out of time. I want to say thanks to the panel members. And thanks to you all for your interest, and let's all have a continued great conference. Thank you.